Welcome to Healing Together. I'm Nicholas Boileau. Today I'm talking with Margi Hofer, whose life took an unexpected turn a couple of years ago when she was diagnosed with Mantle Cell Lymphoma. Margi and I talk about that moment and what came next in her not-so-linear journey as a cancer patient. We discuss how to digest the diagnosis of an incurable cancer, why she kept working, and how her support network helped. Margi shares her advice for people who find themselves in a similar situation. So without further delay, my conversation with Margi Hofer. Maybe a good place to start is for you to set the scene about your diagnosis, because at that point you weren't just diagnosed with a rare disease, but from what I understand, you were also at a really important intersection in your life.
It was just over 2 years ago, and my husband Andrew and I were at an exciting turning point in our lives. Tense, but exciting. We had been living in the suburbs for nearly 30 years. We had been going through a grueling commute for many, many years, and our youngest was just about to graduate from high school, and we made the decision to sell our house and move to the city. And with that came a lot of dreams about what this new life would be like, found hours in the day, and more time to do the things that we love to do, go to concerts and museum openings and go out to dinner. And so we were going through the stress of emptying out a house with 25 years of accumulation and looking for an apartment and getting our youngest son settled. And all of a sudden, it seemed like the world came crashing down with this cancer diagnosis.
And what happened? Here you are changing your life, busy, probably balancing, juggling work, and your youngest graduating from high school and moving. What made you aware that something was different, something was going on with you?
Ironically, I felt really healthy. I had not a clue that anything was wrong, but I discovered some lumps running down the side of my chest wall, and I was pretty sure they were not normal. I saw my doctor, and I had a fine needle aspiration, which indicated non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. What the lumps were actually enlarged cancerous lymph nodes. And within a few weeks, I had removal and biopsy of a lymph node, and that confirmed a diagnosis of mantle cell lymphoma. And then following that, a PET scan and a bone marrow biopsy that allowed them to stage it at stage 4 and 50% bone marrow involvement. So they had a sense of how advanced the cancer was. But oddly, through all this, I was feeling pretty healthy.
And are you someone who can stay on a health track even when you're in a mentally very difficult to process place? From what I understand, there's this weird paradox, right? That we're told the best thing we can do in life is get good sleep, stay calm, pay attention to our psychological and emotional health. And at the same time, that must be just the most extraordinarily difficult thing to maintain and do when you're wrestling with a life-changing diagnosis.
Yeah, one of the really good pieces of advice I got early on from my sister, who's an MD, was to find a mental health professional and get this relationship in place, because I was getting on a roller coaster ride, and not just for the immediate future and dealing with the diagnosis, but living with cancer. It was going to include a lot of ups and downs. So I took her advice and found a fabulous psychiatrist who was immensely helpful. I had never sought the services of a mental health professional before, and I think it was one of the most important steps I took at that time. I was able to keep on my daily life. I found work to be really therapeutic. So I missed very little work in those early days of still trying to figure things out, but not yet going into treatment. Um, that allowed me to feel a sense of normalcy and to keep my mind on things other than my health.
Was a psychiatrist someone who specialized in people who had just been diagnosed with cancer?
She had a lot of experience with patients dealing with serious illnesses. I actually found out later that she was also going through her husband's own very serious health decline. So she did have a lot of experience to draw on.
Can you explain a little bit about the illness itself? You said it's incurable. What do you mean by that?
Well, mantle cell is a form of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and lymphomas are blood cancers like leukemia. Specifically, lymphoma is a cancer of the white blood cells. And mantle cell is one of the 70 plus types. And it's pretty rare. It represents about 6% of the non-Hodgkin lymphomas. There are only about 4,000 new cases a year. It typically begins with enlarged lymph nodes, but then it spreads to other organs, including the GI tract, the bone marrow, the liver. And when I was diagnosed, it had already invaded my GI tract and was in my bone marrow. And it can also spread to the brain and the spinal cord. It does respond to treatment, but patients always relapse. So in that sense, it is incurable.
What I understand from the little bit of research I did is that it also tends to show up in people over 65 and I think a 3-to-1 ratio men over women. So both by your age and by your gender, you would have been a minority among those affected by this illness. Was that just completely impossible to digest?
Well, it did feel odd to be continually referred to as young and fit. Being in my mid 50s, I didn't really consider myself young. I fell into a very different cohort than the typical mantle cell patient. And happily, that really boded well for my prognosis relative to other mantle cell patients. It did mean that going online and looking at those survival rates, I really had to adjust what I was seeing from the get-go. I had a much better outlook than the average patient.
Was there ever a moment where you just at the beginning just didn't want to engage and fight, or was it right away, let's get to work and deal with this?
It didn't take me long to just feel ready for battle. One of the difficult things early on was that there were a lot of treatment options and decisions to make. It was frightening to be the one to have to make those decisions, and they were life-changing decisions. I could opt for very aggressive treatment that would improve my chances for long remission and longer overall survival. But those more aggressive treatments are very toxic and carried definite risks with them. I could opt for less aggressive treatment, which may or may not bring the same results, but it would mean a less impact on my daily life. Less aggressive treatments would allow me to continue working, and overall would be less toxic and perhaps have fewer side effects. So those were difficult calculations to make, but it didn't take me long to come to the conclusion that I wanted to go for the most possibly effective treatment that there was, and I would take the risks of the toxicity. And once I made the decision that I wanted to go with the most aggressive treatment, I was ready to sort of buckle up and just be ready to start.
So in this case, the most likely effective treatment is also the one that's going to be the most difficult to handle physically, right? Probably emotionally and
Right.
mentally too.
Right.
Can we talk a little bit about your community, where you turned first for help and information and comfort, and really how that changed over time?
Well, my husband was and still is my number one source of support, my rock, and he was amazing from the get go. My two sisters were and are also way up there. They're very important members of my support community. It was a very hard time for me at diagnosis because I could not lean on my parents, who would have been incredible sources of support. And my father had died 5 years before of ALS. He was a physician and a very, very practical and calming person. And I desperately missed him at that time. But I did hear his voice of reassurance in my head. And my mother, sadly, was in the midst of a decline from Lewy body dementia. And my sisters and I came to the decision that we shouldn't inform her of what was going on, that it would be confusing and stressful and just not to anyone's benefit. So I was without her support as well, and yet in regular contact. And it was pretty awful to have to weasel weasel through conversations without being clear about what was going on in my life. But she passed away just 6 weeks ago, and I'm pretty sure that was the right thing to do. And then my friends were incredibly helpful as support. And I joined a Facebook group, specifically for mantle cell patients, and found some comfort in being part of a community of people and caregivers dealing with mantle cell. There were pros and cons to that. I would, typically look at my Facebook feed every morning, and Andrew, my husband, always knew when there was a bad piece of news on the Facebook group, because it would put me into a mini depression when I would hear about someone's death or particularly hard struggles. But yet there were also great stories of resilience and long remissions and great encouraging words of support there.
And you said when we were preparing for this discussion, you had talked to me about the importance of a couple of cancer buddies, quote unquote, in your journey. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I had two important cancer buddies going through treatment. One of them was someone I met through the Facebook group, who it turned out was seeing the same doctor, diagnosed with a similar form of mantle cell in terms of staging and aggressiveness, and was going through the same treatment. But he was about 2 months ahead of me, and he very kindly kept me abreast of his journey and described in detail what it was like to undergo the treatments, what it was like physically, what it was like mentally, and we did meet up for coffee at one point when we were both heading to the hospital on the same day, and that was really reassuring because it's so hard to imagine from someone who's green and facing this treatment what it's really like. And then a very important relationship going through my treatment was with a dear friend who I'd known for nearly 30 years. We had kids the same age. And we had a depth of shared experience. Parents with ALS, we had sons with learning and behavioral issues. So we had this past of really leaning on each other. And she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer about a month after my diagnosis, even though our treatments were somewhat different, and there were a lot of differences. There was certainly a lot of shared experience and definitely shared anxieties and fears. And one of the really profound memories I have from early on in my journey is visiting her in the hospital after she had had an initial emergency surgery shortly after her diagnosis. And we really bared our souls to one another and talked very frankly about our fears and the awful idea that we might not live to see our boys married or partnered. We might not meet our grandchildren, and how painful that thought was. But we also laughed and, joked about how we never signed up for this and where did this come from and why us. And as I was starting chemo, she was a great source of support, and she'd give me advice on what I could possibly keep down when I was incredibly nauseous. She sent me texts of encouragement, and I sent her texts of encouragement. So that was really a very, very important source of support.
It just sounds like such a painful trajectory, and yet you talk about these sources of support, and I think I can hear a smile. So it sounds like these were bright spots in a really, really difficult time.
Yeah, absolutely. Sadly, with Leslie, her trajectory took a different path from mine, and I still have a lot of trouble dealing with that, processing that. She died last August. It was really difficult. There was a clear point when my scans were coming back clean and her scans were coming back with new growths, and I desperately wanted to keep her at my side, and it was just a really, really painful thing to watch, her final decline. But she was stoic, and she died with such dignity, and I learned a lot from her, even up through the very end.
There must be some difficulty processing when one person goes one way and one goes another. And yet it must also be something that, in a way, each of you might have expected silently at one point or another.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly when we first received our diagnoses, neither of us knew really where we'd be in a year or 2 years or 5 years, and absolutely could have gone any way. Yeah, it's really hard to understand, and really it makes you angry when someone gets the bad end of the stick, particularly someone who is so loving and has so much to offer, so much more of their life to live, and has already suffered their own losses. It just seems unbearably cruel.
Right. And I imagine there's a host of difficulties that come from just being the survivor. Clearly, the person who is not surviving has the bad end of the stick, but the survivor ends up with a lot of weight on their shoulders.
Yeah. But I try and think of the positive, which is that I carry with me some of Leslie's goodness, which I feel she transmitted to me through this experience. And I have another good friend who who died of lung cancer 5 years ago. And I feel there's a little part of her that I can carry forward. So I try and see that as a responsibility in a way to keep their memories alive.
What about the other people around you? Were there ways in which the people who you needed to relate to on a daily basis and who were not in your boat? I mean, they're in your boat, but they're really not in your boat because they're not experiencing what you're experiencing as you're going through this. Were there ways in which some were particularly helpful and maybe some ways in which people were unhelpful, even if they meant well, that might be important for other people to hear?
I was really moved by the actions of my friends. I was overwhelmed by the support that I had from friends and from family. And there were some who perhaps did more than others, but I can't think of anyone who was really unhelpful. I really appreciated any overture, any show of support. And I encourage anyone who has friends, family, acquaintances dealing with a serious illness, just not to shy away from talking about it. I'm sure there are people with different views, but I think in general, showing up and showing your support and showing how you care is always the better choice than to stay away. Particularly during the periods that I was hospitalized, I relied so heavily on visits from friends, and just their presence made all the difference. I was isolated in the hospital for quite a long time, and that was so meaningful to me. And the small gestures, the going out in search of food that my roiling stomach would accept, or bringing in special home cooked meals. There were wonderful gestures that I really appreciated, and there were friends who were not close friends, but all of a sudden our relationships blossomed. I had one friend from graduate school who would send me long letters, handwritten letters, which no one ever sends these days. And those were just a wonderful diversion. So those small gestures meant a great deal to me.
Yeah, it sounds like your advice was, or your advice to friends would be to lean in and really address it and be part of it.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of an interview with Sheryl Sandberg where she talked about having breakfast with someone who didn't mention the fact that her husband had just died. And she said the person was thinking, why mention this thing and bring it up? And what she said, and I can't remember the exact words, but the sentiment was, it's brought up already. It's part of my DNA every moment of the day. So by bringing it up and addressing it with me, you actually help me share it with someone instead of, being in this la la land where you're avoiding it and not talking about what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And I was very open and honest at work with my colleagues. I know there's some people who find that it's hard in a professional setting to be open about a serious illness, but I couldn't see any other way, particularly since I was going to be absent from work for a long period of time and come back with no hair. I think it would be pretty obvious that something was going on, and openness seemed to be the only way to go.
And you kept working.
Well, I did through my induction chemotherapy, which happened over a period of 3 to 4 months. I kept working. I did have inpatient chemotherapy for 3 days at a time. So I was out of work for usually 4 days, but then back for the 2 weeks in between. And that really helped me, I think. Sometimes I felt pretty crappy, but I think I felt a lot better than I would have felt just lying around in bed. So the work was a blessing to me. But I did, when I was undergoing stem cell transplant, I was out for 10 weeks, and there was simply no option for me to be at work during that time. Part of the time I was hospitalized, and then part of the time I was so immunocompromised that I wasn't allowed to be around people.
And is that harder to not have work in a way because you're not? I keep thinking of the human being as an organism that needs to be engaged. And it's sort of like you're untethered in this no man's land where you're in hospital, out of hospital, isolated because you're immunocompromised. How do you handle that on a intellectual or even an emotional basis to remember that you're still tethered and these things are waiting for you?
Well, I actually made a decision to disconnect entirely from work for that period of time, because I'm pretty type A, and it's hard for me. I check my email all the time, and I knew that it would be very difficult for me to just lighten up. So I cut the cord completely, and instead I really focused on the work of recovery, and my days had structure to them, and sometimes the only structure was that I had to get up and do some laps around the hallway to make sure that my muscles didn't become too atrophied. And I was given a lot of encouragement that that's the way to discharge, is to just keep moving, keep walking. So I did fill my days. There were periods where I couldn't even read because my vision was compromised by the chemotherapy drugs, and I had zero concentration. But somehow the days did manage to pass with some semblance of structure, and I got through without work. But I took it up again, very happily. And a few weeks before I was allowed to return to the office, I did start working remotely, and that was really nice to get back into things.
And was there a moment when I mean, you describe a scene where, you said, I think your eyes weren't working well because of the treatments. It must be hard to maintain confidence that your organism will recover and handle all this basically poison that's going into it.
Mhm.
Was there a moment when the tide turned and when you suddenly felt like, okay, my body is now doing the work of recovering, it's getting stronger, I see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, it wasn't a straight path to recovery, because I had a few setbacks, but there was definitely a nadir, and it was all pretty predictable. In the course of recovery from a stem cell transplant, they tell you that, I can't remember, it's something like 7 days after they infuse your stem cells where you feel the absolute worst. And they had allowed me to go to an outpatient, basically a medical hotel across the street, instead of staying in the hospital room the whole time. And I was so excited about that, because Andrew and I could be together, and it seemed a little more normal than being in a hospital bed. But within a few days, I was having such trouble that they had to readmit me. I was really weak and had constant diarrhea and vomiting and low blood pressure. And I can't remember all the issues. But anyway, they decided they had to admit me. And that was really very discouraging. And I started getting better. And then I developed a blood clot. And that was a huge setback as well. They put me on blood thinners, which caused more complications. But yes, there was finally a time when it really did seem like I was on the mend, and that gave me a lot of hope and encouragement to really keep up the daily walking and keep my spirits up.
Has your understanding of death changed from being so sick?
Well, I think it has. I think feeling closer to death has prompted me to live my daily life with more purpose and awareness, and to make sure that every day counts. So I don't spend a lot of time thinking about death itself, but what's going to happen between today and my death. And 2 years ago, death just seemed something so far out that it didn't really need to be factored in. So in a sense, it's given me more clarity to the present day, and I find that I'm more inclined to say yes to the things that make me happy, and to say no to requests that are going to add to my stress. I find that I'm more cognizant of the gratitude I have for all the blessings in my life, my incredible husband and kids and extended family, a job that I love, financial comfort. So that tends to be the way I think about death. But there are times that I still feel that terrible sadness around the possibility that I won't be around for grandchildren, for my kids' marriages, for this relaxed retirement that Andrew and I had envisioned. So I do worry about that.
When we talked earlier, we were talking about COVID-19 and this pandemic. And from what I understand at this point, most of us will emerge from this pandemic knowing someone who's suffered a tragedy because of it, or having someone in our own families either has gotten very sick or died. Can you say anything about how where you are and what you've been through puts a lens for you on this moment in history?
Well, I certainly feel a lot of compassion for people who are hospitalized and unable to see their family and friends, because I know that isolation can be soul numbing. I feel like I have a little more perspective on that. I also I'm very familiar now with isolation and face masks and hand sanitizer. They were a big part of my life a year ago. So some of this feels familiar. But I am compromised, and it does make me a bit scared. I'm still doing immunotherapy treatments every 8 weeks. I'm 1 year into 3 years of maintenance therapy, which studies show can increase the length of remission. But a side effect of this immunotherapy treatment is that it lowers your immunities. Specifically, it lowers your lymphocyte count. So my doctor in the second week of March advised me not to to go to work any longer. I am still uncertain what this will mean for me going forward, and I hope there will be a little more clarity as more and more patients undergoing this type of therapy have contracted coronavirus, and we understand how they're able to combat it, and whether in fact they are at increased risk.
Yeah, so the universe has added another scary layer on top of an already scary situation.
Yeah.
I realize we're getting to the end of our time, but if you have time for one more question.
Mm-hmm.
I always wonder if there was that one thing, there are different stages of life where we get that one bit of advice. I probably inappropriately thinking of my wedding day right now, where someone said, make sure you take some time away from the crowd and just talk to each other. In a very different situation with your illness over the course of the last few years, was there one, or were there one or two pieces of advice that fell into the best advice you got category that you can pass on to others?
I think this wasn't advice given to me, but advice that I would pass on to anyone else going through a serious illness is your support team is everything, and you need to let in your family and friends and let them know you need them, you value their support, and let them know how they can help, because no one can do this alone, and that's really your life support. And then I also think maintaining a sense of humor and lightness, even in the midst of something really difficult, is really therapeutic. I think smiles and laughter are a necessity, and there are places, even in the darkest days, there are places to find a little bit of levity, and that helps you get through.
Do you have a funniest moment that you can remember?
It wasn't funny at the time, but looking back on it, we laugh a bit, and that is at perhaps the nadir of my stem cell transplant recovery. I was readmitted to the hospital, and they insisted on taking my weight first in the outpatient day hospital, and then when they admitted me to my room, they wanted to take my weight again, and I kvetched at them, and I said, "You just weighed me like an hour ago. Really, do I have to do this?" And they said, "Oh yes." And so I got up and to stand on the scale, and then I fainted.
Oh no!
And collapsed on the floor, and they all these doctors and nurses came rushing in. But I had the feeling of, well, I showed you.
Yeah, I'm not going to let you take my weight no matter what. This has been a really, really pleasant conversation. I really appreciate you being so open about it and sharing, and hopefully your wisdom and your tale will give some encouragement to someone else.
That would be nice. Nice to think of.
Thanks for being on.
Thank you for being interested in the story.
Healing Together is produced by Healthenly. Our theme song is Ramble, composed and performed by Ed Morneau.